Greetings, all. Greetings. I gotta say, every day I get uh, these videos that either come up because of subscriptions I have or emails. And today, I want to share some knowledge with you. This knowledge I know because I lived it. And I studied economics, and to some degree, I studied China. And I watched this thing going forward and saw how the US was making an error. But what can I do? I don't have the economic power. And even some of those who have the economic power and the connections couldn't stop it. There were people in the government. I don't know if you read videos, listened to videos by a guy called Mersheimer. He's a professor at one of the top economic universities. When I say economic universities, that's the school that Barack Obama went to. The group that he associated with is the group that put Obama into office. Obama didn't one day decide to become president. They chose him. From the time he was a child, Obama was bred to be the president of the United States. You may not want to believe that, but it's true. And he's not the first. Bill Clinton, Al Gore, George Bush. You see where I'm going here? They were all bred to be president of the United States. This, what I'm going to let you listen to, some of it, is a lesson in history about arrogance. And the US went to China in 1971 to break China away from the Soviet Union. That's what people solely believe. But that's not the only thing that caused the US to go to China. If you want to lower wages in America, if you want to take back control from what people thought were, they thought they didn't have enough control over their own companies to control the American worker. American worker was getting too powerful because of the unions. They had to pay a living wage. The other thing is that they could see that America was kind of reaching its zenith, and to continue paying a living wage to its workers means that their profits, they couldn't make the kind of profits that they're making now. Like I told you about Apple the other day. They make a cell phone for $300 or $200 and sell it for $1,200. And they're not the only people who do it. Samsung does it too. But then you have the Chinese companies that do it too. But you have other Chinese companies that make that cell phone for $100, $200, and they don't sell it for $1,100. They sell it for $300 or $400. Apple don't have a cheap phone, but Rimby has one. Honor has one. But I want you to listen to this carefully. First, I want to show you the guy who is doing the videos. Nolan Matthias. Go visit his channel. He puts out some good videos. Sometimes his information is not, he's got a little bias. Of course, he's American. I have a little bias. But this one is a history lesson that you need to learn. Why the US will never beat China in a trade war. And he told right to, it's, my goodness, the whole story. Here we go.
The US actually still had that leverage. They made a fatal mistake that showed everybody their hand and could reshape the global economic order as we know it. Because it turns out that the US is never going to beat China in a trade war. And I'm going to reveal why the US has played all its cards and why China now has the upper hand, making it potentially the next global superpower. But in order to understand how we got here, we need to take a little bit of a look at history, because there was a beginning to the end, a significant mistake that the US made that essentially rolled
Before I
out the red
continue
carpet,
too
so to
far,
speak, for China to establish.
I want to establish something. This is, I'm giving you this information under the fair use doctrine in the United States, where you can, for educational purposes, I can show you your information that teaches you something that you need to know. And this you really need to know.
At least in theory, global dominance. And while nobody thought that this would play out so soon and so quickly, the US made a fatal mistake going to war, in a trade war, with China, where it turns out China actually holds all the cards, primarily because of something that the US encouraged China to do. And that was to join the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, at the time, encouraging China to join the WTO seemed like a good idea. The US hoped that it would create economic integration and political reform, making China a little less communist and maybe a little bit more democratic. You see that they thought opening up China from a trade perspective would also open them up politically, but it didn't. And this was a turning point that would eventually lead the US to a perilous position, one where they thought they had all the cards but obviously didn't, one where they would pick a fight that they couldn't win, where China could just retaliate and retaliate and retaliate with almost zero concern for their own economic well-being.
Not only that, the US thought that by bringing China into the WTO, they could turn China into a vassal state permanently. Get rid of the Chinese Communist Party, and they can run China. It's the same process that they attempted to do with Ukraine and Russia. They figure Ukraine would beat Russia. They would divide up Russia into these smaller territories and rule Russia from Washington. And they made a strategic error with Russia, because the man running Russia at the time was Putin. And he wasn't the drunk that Putin replaced. He wasn't the soft person like Gorbachev. Putin knew America. He knew he had to, if he's going to revive Russia, turn it into a self-governing state, he had to have the strength to do it, but the will to also negotiate if necessary. And what Putin did was a strategic move. He negotiated to say, hey, he showed the Chinese, you see, we are negotiating. He showed everybody, we negotiating. But at the same time, he was warning the West, look, we are negotiating with you. We would like to be friends with you. We would like to join you. But some of the things you're doing are wrong. We're not going to accept it. Guess what happened? Nobody listened. Nobody listened to what to what people were saying that were against what they were planning. Those people they call the neocons, and I told you about them. They existed from Roman times. You would read the Bible, the story of Ruth, and you see it completely different to the way it actually was. They teach you that story as a story about this perseverance, this woman who honored God, and it wasn't about that. You better read the other story, the one where these people put Ruth in front of the king, and the king was so enamored with her that they took over his kingdom. They took over his kingdom. They're doing it in America. They did it in Rome. They did it to the Assyrians. They did it to the Persians. Who do you think let the invading army underneath the city to come in? And you guys got history. You're not keeping an eye on it. So this is about the history that you're learning today. What's going on with China? Keep an eye on this one, because it's going to affect you. Even if you go to Africa, it's going to affect you. And I'm going to tell you what's going to happen with Africa if the U.S. keeps up this trade war.
While at the same time putting the U.S. at a significant disadvantage, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about the impact that China joining the WTO had on trade with America. Because in the early 2000s, the US only imported about $100 billion worth of goods. But over the next 20 years, that number would increase to over $500 billion worth of goods. But while the US outsourced manufacturing to China and started importing a significant amount of goods, China didn't buy as much from the US as the US was buying from them, which led ultimately to a pretty significant trade deficit. But it also led to one other major problem, and that was the fact that the US, having outsourced most of its manufacturing to China, now was kind of in a position where they didn't have the tools they needed to produce the things that they potentially needed at home, putting them at the mercy of China without even realizing it. At this point, they essentially gave away all of their leverage if they were ever to get into any sort of war or trade war with the nation that was across the Pacific. And this has become known as the China shock, where Chinese exports exploded after 2001. And at the same time, it's estimated that somewhere between 500,000 and 2.4 million jobs were erased from the American economy. Now, these are manufacturing jobs. And unfortunately, while the overall impact of more trade with China was a net benefit to the entirety of the United States, there were certain areas of...
You hear what he said? These were manufacturing jobs. Now, the U.S. made a strategic decision to go into the higher end of manufacturing. Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, GE engines, Caterpillar tractors, John Deere, chemicals. All these things are high end. That's why you see those beans that no one can grow unless they have a special chemical. That's what the U.S. strategically decided to do. And the other thing is weapons. Weapons manufacture. Create wars throughout the world so a U.S. manufacturer of weapons can sell their weapons. And the weapons world is, bigger than manufacturing, bigger than selling cows and pigs, bigger than corn. So the U.S. decided, you know what? You don't want to pollute our land with the chemicals. Let China manufacture and pollute their land. You know, we don't want to make things that cost $5, $10, $15. Let China make it. We'll buy it from China for $2 and still sell it at $20. Enter Apple. And I always come back to Apple because Apple is one of the great examples of you. Anyway, let's continue with what you're doing.
The country that were more impacted than others by jobs moving overseas. So most of this new trade that had a net benefit to the US as a whole was at the expense of certain local markets. And by the way, those certain local markets, well, they kind of have a pretty big say when it comes to voting. And even though most of the rest of the world doesn't remember that these jobs were lost and certain industries were impacted, the people that were impacted, well, they certainly have a memory that goes back 10 to 20 years. Which, when all of this China stuff started getting politicized in 2016, was the reason why Donald Trump, on his first and second term, well, was able to get voted in by those states that had been affected by the China shock. And
you hear what he said. You hear what he said. Biden was trying to tell you Trump is this megalomaniac, but these people were saying, hey, you're part of the problem that why we lost our jobs. And though Biden was giving them millions in money, they were saying, hey, yeah, you're giving us some welfare, but we want jobs. And Trump was saying, I'm going to bring these jobs back. He will not be able to do it because AI is going to take over anything that's manufactured in the US. And remember my video about the Chinese the Chinese manufacturer that has 3 employees. 1, the guy who built the AI. 2, the guy who is keeping the AI running. 3, the guy who watches the dog. And the dog is there for security. Yes, it is a kind of overblown scenario, but it tells you something. When that comes to America, the jobs are not coming back. That's the only way America can compete. And they might not be able to compete because the cost of manufacture is still twice as high in America as it is in China. That's why people can manufacture something in China, put it on a boat, bring it to the US. Even with the taxes, you pay less than manufactured in America. You think American manufacturer is going to build it here in America? No, he's not. He's going to continue to build it in China or wherever it is in the world and bring it to the US. Pay the tax and still be able to make more money than he would if he built it here. But let's go on.
Suggestion that jobs needed to come back to the US in order to make that happen. But the question is, how easy is it for those jobs to return? And the answer is, well, it's highly unlikely. You could probably bring the manufacturing back to the US, but if you bring it back to the US, it's probably going to be automated in such a way that those jobs will never re-exist. The onshoring of manufacturing might be something that's possible in 3 to 5 years, but the return of the jobs, well, it's highly unlikely. But nonetheless, China joining the WTO showed that there were significant cracks in the system. The first was that there was persistently a US trade deficit with China, which makes sense in a lot of ways when you are the world's most prosperous country and you have the most money to spend and you're consuming the most, you're probably going to be consuming goods from other suppliers in other countries. But nonetheless, China joining the WTO showed that there were significant cracks in the system. The first was that there was persistently a US trade deficit with China, which makes sense in a lot of ways when you are the world's most prosperous country and you have the most money to spend and you're consuming the most, you're probably going to be consuming goods from other suppliers in other countries. But there was more to it than just that. There was also the accusations of currency manipulation. China making its goods cheaper by manipulating its own currency. There was the unfair subsidies that were being given to Chinese companies to make them more competitive in the international market. And
that is one thing that they use, but it's not really Well, okay. Take for instance, Boeing. Boeing gets to manufacture, a substantial amount of weapons in the U.S. The U.S. gives them the contract, gives them the money to build and test whatever. And then the U.S. might have two companies doing it, and they pay for everything. That is a subsidy. Farming in the U.S. The U.S. gives farmers subsidies, except for black farmers, and we know why. Anyway, the U.S. gives farmers a subsidy in the U.S. Otherwise, they couldn't sell their crops to any of the world at a price that is competitive with the rest of the world. Even look at today. China would rather take crop from Brazil and Russia. The other day, China, 600,000 tons of beef from the U.S. Said, send it back. Send it back to the U.S. And took Russian cows, Russian beef, Argentine beef, Brazilian beef. So even with the subsidies that the U.S. put in, Chinese don't say, well, look at you, you're subsidizing these. But the U.S. always talks about how China subsidizes, while we are subsidizing everything. We subsidize everything. When a business in America, say Google, when Google started out, all the money that they got is tax deductible subsidy. But we don't see it as that. We thought see it as a tax deduction. It says tax deduction, subsidy. Facts are facts.
Americans taking exception. That was Fight Back, to challenge the second place player at a game where they were already dominant, were already winning, and potentially, if they made the wrong move, could show the entire world that they weren't the dominant player that everybody thought they were. And this started in 2018 with Trump's first trade war with China. And as Trump took up a fight with US manufacturers, China turned around and took up a fight with US farmers. Meaning that an industry, a group of people that weren't in a fight, were all of a sudden brought into a fight. And that should have been the first sign that picking a fight with China was not a good idea, because it could lead to collateral damage in industries that had nothing to do with the trade war to begin with. Manufacturing jobs get destroyed, US goes to war with China, China destroys farmers. Now you've got two industries that are destroyed instead of just one. Now, this was mostly settled, but fast forward 5 years, and here we are once again. This all starts in February 2025 with a 10% tariff being reintroduced to multiple countries. Then in March, it increases to 20%. And this is all framed as a fentanyl issue. It's a drug issue. It's national security. But then in March, it increases to 20%. And this is all framed as a fentanyl issue. It's a drug issue. It's national security. But it's not.
Oh.
It's an attempt to reshape the world order. A world order where the US is the dominant country and expects to continue to be, but uses that power to bully other nations, only to find out that the power it thought it had, well, it wasn't actually there. And that's where we end up in April of 2025. The US realizing that it doesn't have the power it thought it did, and that other countries, especially China, aren't backing down. Because as this is all happening, China starts to realize that it actually holds a lot more cards than it originally thought it did. And as this tit-for-tat war plays out, you see the US impose 10% tariffs. Then it increases them to 20. And China just sits on the sidelines and goes, okay, whatever. But then all of a sudden, the US raises tariffs, another 34%. And China goes, okay, you know what? We've had enough. We're going to reach. And at the end of the day, we end up in a situation where the US now has 145% tariffs on Chinese goods, and China has 125% tariffs on US goods, and they basically said, this is as far as we're going to go, at least with respect to tariffs, because there's no point in it going any further.
You heard what he said. The Chinese says there's no point in us going any further. China already went into their system. China don't use the AI just for playing games now. This is not a playing Batman and Superman games. China looks at the world as it is and says, if this happened, scenario. US has war games scenario. Chinese have war games and economic scenarios. Chinese were already prepared for this. It doesn't make sense going over 125% because whatever happened, it's a waste of time after that. Now the US might think that they can do better or worse or something more to affect the Chinese market. And you come back to the tariffs that he suspended, because here's where those suspended tariffs come in. Because if he put the tariffs on other countries that deal with China, and we talked about this before, then these countries say we have to stop dealing with China and deal with the US. Funny thing is, if you want a TV, where are you going to buy it from? You know, China sells garlic to the US because the US don't hardly grow any garlic anymore. So you got to consider these things. US don't have any manufacturing, so where are they going to buy the stuff from? The tariffs that they charge in Chinese goods, American people have to buy the goods if they want them. Otherwise, they have to go without them. And American people don't like going without. They're at a stage in their life where they think, we deserve everything. Listen to American women when they talk to their men. Say, we don't need you. We need your resources. And if you can't provide it with your resources, we don't need you. Yeah. You guys are not listening. Now, China has probably about 2 or 3 cars to play. And one of them is in Africa. And they haven't played that card yet. China gives up a market of 325 million people and goes into an African market, 150 billion people. Don't let them fool you with that foolishness, but Africa don't have as many people as China. That's because they don't count half of Africa. You hear what I'm telling you? They don't count half of Africa. And they think by the wars that they create, that they can kill off as many to bring the numbers down. The AIDS thing, the corona virus thing. But you have to look at it factually. And China has a market in Africa that they can expand very quickly. China can build a factory in 6 months where it take the US 3 years to build. So if you build a car in Africa, if you bring that factory in to assemble that car in Africa and sell it in Africa, guess what's going to happen? BYD doesn't need to sell cars in America. You get where I'm going, right? So America is shooting itself in the foot. And they know it. but the people who are telling that they don't want to listen to. And he just explained to you why.
As much as you want, because there's a point where it doesn't matter. And when we get to that point, what you're going to realize is that you need us more than we need you. And this is where you see the breaking point. We're at all-out war with one of our biggest trading partners, and without a doubt, one of the most significant suppliers of goods to the US consumer. And the WTO estimates that this is going to reduce trade between the US and China by up to 80%. But worse than that, it's going to fragment trade along geopolitical lines, meaning that China and the East is probably going to take its ball and go home and leave the West to figure out stuff on their own. And there's a huge problem with this, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. But it has to do with the control that China has of some pretty important products. And also,
Ta-da! I just told you that. China takes its ball, go home. Go do business with other people in the rest of the world. Forget about the US. Those televisions that we're talking about, that people kill themselves in a Walmart and Target every year at December 4. Can't get them anymore. And if you get them now, it's not costing $200. It costs $1,000. The rest of the world can buy it for $200. You get it. Anyway, I'm running over time by time at the allotted budget. So you get where I'm going though. Listen to this video. Go look at this video yourself. It is, one of the best videos I've ever seen. Seriously. More information in here than you can read in just one history book. And there are few books that you can read out there that will give you this information. I've seen some of them. And I didn't get all the information from just one. Like I said, I was studying this information from 1971. So that should tell you. Anyway, peace. Have a great day wherever you are.